Well, hello and welcome to the Real Zero podcast. I'm on my own this week because my colleague Dan is away with family matters. But that matters not because I'm joined today by a guest I've been wanting to talk to you for absolutely ages. So welcome, Tim. Let me just ask you, first of all, perhaps you can introduce yourself. Who are you and what do you do in the world of climate change and why should we believe a word you say?
Yes, hi Hugh. I'm Tim Lenton. I'm a professor of climate change and also Earth System Science at the University of Exeter down in Devon in the UK. I've been working for 30 years on understanding the Earth as a complex system, including the climate, and more recently, how we could change our complex social systems to kind of avoid the rapidly accumulating climate crisis. So
Brilliant.
yeah, I teach and I research that stuff.
Thank you, Tim. And I'm pretending to be the numpty here, but of course, the reason I want you on is you really do know your beans here. So I'm very grateful that you joined us. We always start with the first question, which is the same one, just so we get a picture of where we are on the alarmed scale. So how long do you think we've got before we start seeing major impacts of climate change on human civilization? And if we don't take any action and we just carry on as we are, how long do you think we've got before things start to seriously unravel?
Well, I think we've seen that impacts hitting us already. It just depends a bit on who you are in the we and how far you've got your feelers out. But, extraordinary flash flood killing 200 odd people in Valencia last year, the fires sweeping through LA, these were pretty visible manifestations, and we don't get it in the Western media as much, but the body bags tragically are piling up from heat and humidity extremes for example, in parts of India, in unprecedented heat waves across Asia the last couple of years, the temperature at a record level that we still can't understand how it's hovered so high for so long because the El Nino has gone away. So the kind of climate crisis is really starting to bite. And if we don't act now and act faster, then within a decade or so, and certainly within the rest of my lifetime, we're really going to see the horror show escalate, I suspect. I worry more about my own kids, of course, but that's roughly where we are.
Yeah, I've said this myself. I mean, I'm 62 and I suspect that I'm going to get hit by it badly. My 19-year-old, I'm very alarmed for. But perhaps we could touch on that because I'm interested in exploring this lag of why, even if we stop now, things continue to get worse. But if you keep adding petrol to the fire, how much more rapidly it gets worse. But perhaps we can just start because people listening to this won't be climate experts necessarily. Can you explain to me a little bit about why the Earth is the temperature that it is, right? I think we all get that if there was an atmosphere at all, it would be the snowball Earth, right? We'd be a freezing blob in the mass of frozen space, but we're not. So why is that? What regulates energy in and energy out?
Yeah, so our big source of energy, if it isn't obvious, is the sun, and the Earth absorbs a chunk of the sun's energy that hits it. It reflects some of it back to space, but it absorbs a chunk of it. And then you've got to ask the question, all right, what happens next? Well, like any object or body in the universe, the Earth also radiates heat. But some of that heat is now in the wavelengths we can't see in the infrared, but it gets absorbed by crucial gases in the atmosphere, what we call the greenhouse gases. It literally triggers those little molecules to vibrate. And then it's kind of quantum mechanics, but they relax back down and re-release that heat energy. And they've caught some of what was coming up from the surface and they send some of it back down again, which adds to heating the surface. That's why we're not living on a frozen ice ball. We're 33 degrees centigrade on average warmer than we would be without an atmosphere. So we're at about 15 degrees centigrade on the planet on average. And it's still, instead of being at like minus 18 and frozen over,
Right. So we've got sunlight coming in as energy that heats us up because we will feel that when the sun's on us. We radiate that heat back. If all of that disappeared, the planet would still be freezing cold, but these greenhouse gases trap some of it there and raise the temperature. I guess the way I think of it, I suppose, is you put the lid on the pan and you raise temperature and it'll reach an equilibrium temperature.
That's right.
Okay, so that's where we're sitting now. So then why does such small differences? Because this is always the argument, isn't it? Well, come on, we were only at 427 parts per million concentration. Pre-industrial was 250 odd. We've only gone up 200 parts per million. That can't possibly make a difference. Why is it making such a difference?
Well, it's making such difference because we're talking there with carbon dioxide about one of the absolutely key greenhouse gases, which in turn affects the concentration of water vapor, which is perhaps the most important one of all. But you've got to think about the water vapor content of the atmosphere itself being a response to the temperature of the planet, because as everybody knows, if you like warm water output, like in the kettle or whatever, it's going to evaporate more moisture into the atmosphere. So if we're talking about going from pre-industrial 280 parts per million of CO2 up to the levels we are now, and then you factor on top of that the fact that by the warming that triggers also means more water vapor in the atmosphere.
Okay.
Oh, and then we could talk about the methane as well. This is a big proportional change in the total greenhouse effect. And remember, the total greenhouse effect was responsible for like 33 degrees of warming in that pre-industrial baseline. So you can get a lot of warming from what seems like a modest trapping of extra heat.
That's a good point, of course. Yeah. So if you're at sort of 250, 280 parts per minute, and that can raise us by 33 Celsius, it does give you a measure. Thank you. I'd not sort of thought of it in that way before. But I suppose the other way of thinking it is that by adding a little bit of extra energy gain per square meter of the Earth's surface, given that the Earth's surface is quite big, that energy gain is driving the temperature up. And of course, we can measure the rate of energy use or gain in watts. How many watts, if we've got a number of that? I mean, everyone would have an idea of a watt. You know, they've got their incandescent bulbs at 50 watts. They might have a 3-watt D bulb, a 100-watt electric heater. What's this, what you would call radiative forcing, this extra wattage of power that we're adding now? Is it from these greenhouse gases?
Yeah, so it might sound modest that the imbalance we've created is probably nearer 2 watts per meter squared than 1. So for like every meter squared of the Earth's surface, a net extra 2 watts coming down. That's not an incandescent light bulb, but I have to check on my LED how many watts that's running on, but it might be like an LED shining down. But the crucial thing is the Earth has to find its balance. So that extra heat's is coming into the system, and then the Earth's got to have to adjust. So it's going to have to warm up until it's radiating that extra amount of heat back to space.
Because 2 watts per square meter, actually, I'm sitting in an office. I was just doing the maths in my head. I reckon this office is probably around 15, 16 square meters. So that's 30 watts. And I'm just thinking of a 30-watt electric heater, and then have one of those for every bit of the Earth's surface the size of this. It actually is quite a lot of energy gain.
Yeah, and absolutely right, Hugh. And you might start thinking, oh, where does all the heat go? Well, the great majority of it goes into the ocean, because the ocean has what scientists would call a much bigger heat capacity than the land. But some of it can also be going to work in an unhelpful way, melting ice. So just to change water from ice to liquid, you put some energy in to do that, what we call a phase change, before things heat up further. But yeah, those extra watts per meter squared, you sum them up over a massive surface of the Earth, and it's a big net input of energy, doing a lot of, almost inconceivably large amount of extra heat pouring into the ocean and going to melt ice sheets.
Yeah, I mean, you're touching on it here, because when people hear, well, we're sort of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, it just doesn't sound alarming, does it? And you would think, how much energy it's taken to cook the entire surface of a planet by 1.5 Celsius, when most of the energy, I'm guessing north of 90%, has gone into the oceans. But of course, it's not really the gain in average temperature that matters, is it? I mean, talk me through a little bit when you talked at the beginning that you deal with complex Earth systems. What starts going wrong when you start heating water up and evaporating it, and when you start melting ice sheets? Why do I care if the ice sheets melt a bit or the ocean's a bit warmer?
Well, yeah, great question. Unfortunately, there's a whole lot of reasons to care, but we need to think about a few different things here. So, yeah, first of all, ice sheets are one of the bits of the Earth system or the climate that can pass tipping points, my specialist subject, where you melted a certain amount of ice, and now the system is amplifying its own shrinkage, if you like, and you're committing to a self-propelling collapse of an ice sheet like Greenland or West Antarctica. And so in those situations, and by the way, we can't rule out that either of those ice sheets are at a tipping point or might even have passed it, then you're committing to an accelerating melt of the ice sheets, and to ultimately together what will eventually be around 10 meters of sea level rise. And by the way, this is completely consistent with Earth history. In fact, give it long enough, and when you look at Earth history, each degree of global warming, remembering that we've already had about 1.3 degrees C, each degree of global warming would give us tens of meters of sea level rise, typically in the long run. It takes a while to melt ice sheets, but it all kind of tallies that way. That's the ice, but you've also got to remember, putting all this extra heat into the system, it's the distribution of the heat in the system, or its redistribution, that is the great patterns of the weather and the circulation currents of the ocean. So unfortunately, we can also risk tipping points where we abruptly change, for example, the circulation of the Atlantic Ocean in a way that would completely change the seasonality of the climate and the patterns of weather for a place like the UK and many other places besides.
Since you've raised it, let's touch on that, because of course we've had 3 papers in the last year or two. 2 of them, I suppose 3 of them, saying that we're at risk of an immediate and complete collapse of the Atlantic Middle Overturn Circulation, the AMOC. One earlier in the year that you'll know of, which was saying we're expecting that complete collapse within 20 to 30 years. And then another one in Nature saying, well, actually, it probably won't collapse completely, may keep going, but it will slow down a hell of a lot. Now, they were saying 50 to 81%. But again, for people that have no idea about this massive transport of huge amounts of energy, why do I care if this massive ocean circulation slows by 50 to 80% or collapses? Why am I bothered?
Yeah, and let me just start by saying, if it slows by 50 to 80% or whatever, that's basically as good as collapse from where we're sitting in the UK, because it means that what happens currently, which is this thing we know as the Gulf Stream, a massive supply of heat to, say, the UK, has basically diverted. It's not come across the UK. It's about turned somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic and circled its way down, maybe past Spain, and sent the heat back down around in the subtropics. Whereas we've suddenly lost the great source of heat that makes our climate so much milder and less variable than an equivalent latitude. If we went across to a similar position relative to the Pacific, we'd be somewhere in the middle of British Columbia in Canada. I think you maybe don't need too much geography training to get a sense that the winters over there are pretty radically snowy. And at the same time, British Columbia is a place which has recorded record temperatures of 49.6 degrees C in summer that burned a whole town littered to the ground only a couple of years ago. So it's a way more seasonal climate than we are, adapted to, let's put it that way, here in Western Europe.
I mean, this is excellent, because it's something, again, that exercised me, this idea that we'll be able to adapt our way out of this. And what we were saying, if we go to a tipping point when we get multi-meter sea level rise, a multi-tens of meter sea level rise, or we suddenly go back to Newfoundland sort of weather and burning in the summer. I'm not sure how we adapt to that. I mean, we'd have to replace presumably
Yeah.
all the road network, all the rail network, our entire agricultural systems.
So I thought you got to make this concrete. So let's concentrate on this Atlantic story because that is the one that could unfold fairly fast. We were just starting to look in our model world like, okay, well, it got a lot colder in winter. The summers could still be super hot. How about rainfall? The simple version is it got a whole lot drier here. So we had a further look. We're like, oh dear, the model can't support crop growing in the UK. That's not great because, okay, we import a lot of food already and that's a big risk for us, but we wouldn't be growing any crops in this world. And then we're like, oh, why can't we grow any crops? Oh, shit, there isn't enough water basically in the south, in, let's say, the East Anglia, and that also relates to the whole southeast of the country where most of the people are. Oh dear, it's still, there's just not enough snow in the winters and to supply the water needs in the summer. Oh dear. Yeah, so like, would you build a massive pipeline to where it still rains or snows on the mountains of Western Britain and try and pipe it down to where all the people are in the southeast? Well, that might, or are people just going to think, oh, sod this, I'm going to leave, find another better climate to live in, and then we'll be the climate refugees. I think we sit on this beautiful island that we all love, or islands that we love, and imagine a future of people coming to us. But what I'm talking about is a possible future where we'll be the climate refugees knocking on somebody else's door.
Well, indeed. And as you made the point with sea level rise, most of Britain, well, actually most of the world, of course, but certainly most of Britain lives very close to the sea. I mean, Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Plymouth, Portsmouth, Southampton. I mean, we're all there. And presumably, even with sea level rise and storm surges, a lot of critical infrastructure is under threat because you need a drop for sewage to be vented, for instance. You need...
your nuclear power stations are often sited near cooling water from the seaside. So if there is any comfort here, the story about the loss of ice sheets is it still takes them a long time to give you the multi-meters of sea level rise. But there's other things that adjust the height of the sea. And this change in the ocean circulation in the Atlantic, I mean, think about it a bit as when you're in the bath or whatever, or you pull the plug out and you see, the water goes down the plug out, that not everything's at the same height, the water. That's true of the ocean as well. The circulation of the ocean affects the height of the surface. The long and the short of it is, you collapse this great overturning circulation, the sea level height adjusts. It can go up in some places, down in others. Unfortunately, it'll be going up around a lot of the North Sea coasts and along the northeast seaboard of the US as well. And that's a fast adjustment, and it's big enough with the storm surges to be, for example, in East Anglia, you can overtop the barrier at Great Yarmouth, and then boom, mass flooding.
And while you were mentioning it there, because of course it is something that we all see, that people focus on not just, let's say, Arctic, but just Greenland, then not just Greenland, but just the Greenland Shelf, not just the Greenland Shelf, but the West Greenland Shelf. And we've been talking there about what happens to the UK's weather and ability to grow food if the MOC collapses. But presumably when we've reached that level of heating and things have changed, things are going wrong everywhere in the world. So it's not we can just pick the phone up and say, can we have a few more sprouts, please?
Yeah, that's right, Hugh. So we just had a quick look-see at that because we realised in this AMOC tipping point, oh dear, actually basically made lots of major crop growing regions, especially for wheat and maize, which are two of the big staples, just aren't viable. So globally, first estimate was that we lost more than half of the areas for growing those major staple crops. How are we going to ride that one out? Well, basically, we'll all need to become eat less meat or become more vegetarian, shall we say, because 80% of the land is currently going to basically turn into meat for calories and protein, but meat only gives us, 18% of our calories and 37% of our protein. So whether we like it or not, we'll be eating less meat if we cross the tipping point. But yeah, the problem is we'll have a world in which monsoons in West Africa, India have been severely disrupted because the whole ocean circulation and atmosphere circulation are coupled together. So it's like, it's kind of the poly crisis, or the people would describe it as it's kicking off all over the place, and everybody's just trying to manage the fallout.
Yeah, because I was looking at the Scorpion reports, which you contributed to, of course, and others, and indeed wrote the forward for. The latest data is you and I know from the States and Jim Hanson's group would say that because of this change in light reflecting back from low cloud, we've accelerated the heating. He says that we're on target for 4.2 Celsius now without action. And of course, we had that release of the banks. As we're recording this now, there was a leak from the banks last week. They've now accepted that we're on target for at least 3 Celsius. Going back to your reports, which I was doing this morning out of interest, of course, they put 3 Celsius into the extreme bracket of impacts, which includes 4 billion people dead and, quoting directly, the loss of higher life forms on Earth. So this is, I guess, what we were talking about earlier on, that 3 degrees still doesn't sound terribly much, but in terms of its societal and biological consequences and economic consequences, it's pretty savage, isn't it?
It is, because the way you've got to, well, it could be, and that's the crucial thing. The way, I've been working with actuaries who you generally think as very staid and calm people on these topics, but you have to look at the problem as a risk problem. So you don't want to just ask, well, what's the most likely thing to happen? If you're an actuary, your job is to say, is this usually company solvent if there's a 1 in 200 event? And if it's not, better do something about it. And when we look at, the risks of climate change, we also need to be saying, well, what happened? What's the worst thing that can happen that we can't rule out? And that's exactly what we've just been talking about. We're talking about utterly catastrophic outcomes, unfortunately. And not at the 1 in 200 level we can debate, but the whole point is to look at 3 degrees C world and see, well, it could be game over there for all of those reasons. We can't go there.
Well, I'd like your take on this, actually, because I was having a conversation with someone morning about risk, and they were saying that we as scientists frame risk incorrectly. So we say, the Lloyd's report from last year saying 1 in 300 chance in 5 years of a single extreme weather event taking 17.6 trillion off the world economy. Now, most people wouldn't want that to happen because that's the end of food and hospitals and education, all sorts of things at that level of economic hit, at a 1 in 300. So most of us wouldn't want to roll that dice. But of course, if we carry on as we are, the risk in the next 5 years isn't 1 in 300. The risk is actually a lot higher. And if we took that forward to 15 years, it's probably not a risk anymore. It becomes almost a certainty. So maybe that's the message we ought to be putting out.
Exactly. If we continue with our sort of, gambling or roulette metaphor, we're loading the dice all the time, or we're very soon in Russian roulette territory, 6 canisters in the gun and one of them's got a bullet, and then we carry on up. And the crazy thing, to my mind, that the climate assessments and a lot of the international discourse has just continued to anchor on, 50, what's going to happen at 50-50 probability, how much more will it be? And this just can't be the right way to think about the problem.
No, I wouldn't get in a car and drive it down a motorway with the 1 in 300 chance of the brakes failing. I just wouldn't no sane.
Totally. No one would get on the aeroplane if you said to them as you came up to the gate, there's a 1 in 300 chance this is going to, or 1 in 200 or whatever, it's going to fall out of the sky. Would you like to get on? Who would get on?
Well, as we have come towards the end, well, I suppose that's a bad thing to say, isn't it? It's come towards the end of this podcast. The 2 questions, first, I guess the fact that you and I are still working like crazy on this, despite the fact we're terrified, means that we don't think it's necessarily too late. If we were to really go at this properly, Tim, really all give it beans, can we avert catastrophe?
Yes, I believe that with a kind of, I believe, a credible grounds of hope rather than just a naive hope. But that's because I've been doing a lot of homework and realizing that in our social systems and in the changes that we need, there are also what I'd call positive tipping points where the change we need to clean technology, diet change, and the rest of it can become self-accelerating as well. In fact, we're already seeing that with the remarkable decline in price and increase in uptake of solar panels, of the batteries that are inside electrifying cars and lots of other things. And we know with the technologies, the behaviors, the things we need are mature. We kind of know the recipe there, and we've seen extraordinary examples of markets tipping. Of course, we know there's a bunch of political actors who believe it's in their vested interest to try and maintain the status quo. But I think all sane listeners can probably get on board with the idea that we do actually have to transform our energy system and our food systems, and that actually there's a load of benefits, other benefits in doing that. And hey, it's great. We've all got the power to get on board with the change and be part of it.
I think this is the positive message. And I was with a company earlier this week, a large health manufacturer, actually, health product manufacturer. And we were having this conversation because they were saying, well, look, it's difficult for us to know. We're told there's going to be net zero carbon NHS, but we're right, NHS England's being dismantled. If we get a right-wing climate denier in to the next government, they may get rid of the things. But their approach was, we're just going to ignore whether we're going to get more stringent regulations or no regulations, because the right thing to do is just do this anyway, right? So we're just going to crack on and do it. And I think that's perhaps, if we ignore the naysayers as individuals and companies, we can act together. So that brings me to the last question I always ask everybody. So, Tim, it is catastrophic. If we don't do anything, I think we both agree all is lost, but we can do something. So what is it genuinely that will make the difference? The many things potentially that you would ask everybody listening to this podcast to go and do the moment they hit the off button, or what they do tonight, or what they do this weekend. What are the things, apart from voting, obviously, for the right parties, what else is it that we can genuinely do that will make a difference tomorrow?
Well, there's as I hope lots of listeners realise, there's obviously practical things we can do as individuals and families and with our friends. We can certainly, if we're still eating meat and particularly beef and lamb, we could do an awful lot, a disproportionate amount of good by eating less of that. And less dairy products come next on the list.
Yes,
we can take less flights, and certainly think about what we're driving and how much we're driving, depending on whether we've switched to electric mobility yet. Those are usually, for most UK citizens, the biggest part of our own footprint. But I also think that we've seen social movements bubble up before the pandemic, Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg and all that. We've seen Extinction Rebellion and others kind of get slammed down by, I think, an absolutely disgraceful changing of the laws in this country that are banging people up in prison for even talking about some protests that are rightly motivated. Whatever you think about the means of the protest, the core reason is to draw attention to this critical issue. So, okay, it's a difficult political climate to go out and do certain kinds of protests, but I think, firstly, we should be fighting against those changes to the law, which I think are a disgrace in this nation, and we need other kinds of social movement. They don't literally have to be, we don't all have to be marching down the street. That's not everybody's cup of tea. But we need this bottom-up social movement where we're with each other, right? And it's as families and businesses and friends, but it's as businesses, it's in whatever role we're playing in life. And from the bottom up, we're like, hold on, there's a load of great stuff to seize on here, and the more of us that get behind it, the faster it's going to go. Let's just get on with it, because if we sit back and we're waiting, we're just going to whinge and go, oh, why haven't the government fixed it? Then we're in big trouble. I mean, it's not all bad. We have a Climate Change Act. It's a wonderful thing. We have a great civil service that's really trying to make sure we meet its targets. But if we get us as the bottom up showing this is what we want to happen, that'll give confidence back in the governance and the top down, and then we're really cooking, basically.
Yeah, I refer to this as the permissive environment. If you create the environment where businesses and politicians will know they'll get your vote with a pound or your vote at the ballot box, then they're going to change. And for those people who haven't listened to this podcast before, if you go to the realzero.earth website, you can find the 7 acts that we suggest people take to take action. And you've emphasized one of them, the big one, which is get other people to do it, create this mass movement, talk to your boss, or if you are the boss can start taking actions, because if we lead, the others will follow. Tim, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure at last talking to you. And it'll be twice in 4 days, because I'm coming down to see you, I think, on Mondays.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks for having me on the podcast. And everyone who wants to read about positive tipping points, I've got a book on that's coming out on the 4th of September, but it's...
And what's it called? Show us the book. Have you got it there?
Here we go. Positive Tipping Points. You can pre-order, I'm sure. How to Fix the Climate Crisis. It's just my best effort to tell us how we can empower each other to be part of the change we need.
Right. Well, thank you, Tim. I will be cycling past my local bookshop this weekend to order a copy, because for the many reasons that you might guess, I don't order from the biggest online supplier of such books. So you'll be getting an order from me, and I hope from others who listen to this. Tim, thank you so much again.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
The Real Zero podcast with Hugh Montgomery and Daniel Grant, produced by me, Daniel Grant, aka The Stealth Doctor, on YouTube and Instagram. Find out more about Real Zero by heading to realzero.earth and find out more about how you and your friends can start making a real difference today.